Okay, good morning, welcome. Let's make a start. So my name is Ben Cousins from PLAAS, Institute of Poverty and Land and Agrarian Studies at University of Western Cape, UWC. Welcome here. Look, land is a big topic at the moment. That's why you're here. But what is it really all about? It's really not that easy to make sense of these complicated land questions. And as journalists, you actually want to have stories you can tell. Simple, straight, human interest stories, but actually which provide real insights. And there's a bit of a tension here between complexity of history, complexity of policy, on the one hand, and telling a good story. But it's the same tension that we academics face, trying to make sense of complexity. How do we analyze this? How do we make sense of it? And it's also a challenge if you're trying to make policy. You're trying to have clear, direct, simple policies which ordinary officials can implement in a context of real complexity. So there are some fundamental tensions here, which I'm sure will emerge in discussion. But I think there's a bit of commonality between the work of media people, the work of analysts like ourselves, and the work of policymakers. We're trying to simplify reality in ways which are adequate to the complexity. And that tension continues. So just to say something first about the structure of our session here. We ran a first version of this on Monday in Cape Town for about 35 people. And we're hoping that we're going to improve on our performance slightly today. We have 8 sessions through the course of the morning. We're going to pack in a huge amount of ground. We're going to follow the format outlined in the invitation. We're going to start the first sessions about history and about the political transition. Second session is about land redistribution. This third session is on land restitution. Then we have a session on post-settlement support and agrarian reform. We'll explain what those terms mean. We'll have a short tea break at 11. Then we'll continue to look at the tenure reform issues. Communal areas, traditional authorities, farm dwellers, labour tenants, then urban land reform with the help of our colleague from Surrey, Lauren Royston, who's just arrived. And then finally, we'll come to the property clause and the debates about expropriation with or without compensation, the big issue of the moment. And then we'll close for lunch. Okay, so that's the logic. Now, the way we're going to do this is present very short 10-minute inputs. And obviously, we can't really do justice to the complexity of the issues in 10 minutes, but we'll try and provide the basics, the key issues, the key debates. We'll provide some background. We'll provide a short input on what policies have been implemented. We'll talk about the outcomes of those policies. And we'll talk about a range of opinions and options which have been presented, so the diversity of views in society. And then we will try to point to some key stories that you might like to follow up on. Places, people, issues. So we have 10 minutes for presentation, and then we open up for 20 minutes for each session for debate, for questions, for discussion. So that's the logic of it. We've provided you with a resource pack, and if you just want to have a look at what's in your resource pack, these might be useful to you in the course of the morning. In the first place, we provided you with a copy of Section 25 of the Constitution of the Bill of Rights. This is the so-called property clause. This is at the heart of the current debates. It's not straightforward to interpret the meaning of these provisions, although it's written in plain English, as is the rest of our Constitution. So at various points through the morning, we'll be coming back to Section 25 and pointing out how redistribution, restitution, tenure reform are attempts to implement the requirements of the Constitution. And at the end, we'll come back to this question of expropriation. We also have a set of 2-page summaries of the recommendations, of the analysis and recommendations of the recent high-level panel of Parliament, chaired by former President Kgalema Motlanthe It was released in November last year. It's available from Parliament's website, together with the background documents prepared for the high-level panel. It is an invaluable resource for society. It's the most comprehensive and systematic recent assessment of land reform. It contains a wealth of detail. In particular, it's a 600-page report, but there are 2 chapters which set out what you need to know about land reform and about linked issues of spatial inequality, which deal with traditional leaders and linked issues. These are 2-page summaries of the key findings of the high-level panel, including its recommendations. They make a number of very far-reaching recommendations, which I think society needs to take carefully. So this is a brief a roadmap of what to look for in the report. We also have in your pack 4 fact checks. These are 1-page infographics and a few statistics and identification of some key issues. One is about the distribution of land in South Africa overall. Number 2 is about what is the demand for land, often a question which comes up. Number 3 is about state land, how much state land is available for land reform. And number 4 is about impacts on beneficiaries, on the livelihoods of beneficiaries. These are written in 2013 for a national conference. They're a little bit out of date, but they're still highly relevant. So these are important resources for you as media people. We also have a list of recommended readings if you want to follow up, and 1 or 2 other things. So bear in mind that this is just a very kind of quick harvest of some of the materials available to you, and we can send you more materials on request. PLAAS itself has something like 200 publications on these issues, ranging from policy briefs to research papers and books and so on. So there's a wealth of material out there if you want to get into these questions in a bit more depth. Okay, now this session focuses on history, and we're going to not do a formal presentation, actually, for this first session. What we're going to do is show you a slideshow of a photographic exhibition called Umhlaba 1913 to 2013. This was a photographic exhibition mounted at the National Museum in Cape Town in 2013 on the centenary of the 1913 Land Act. It was prepared to run in conjunction with a national conference which PLAAS and partners organized on that date. It's a very, very powerful exhibition by some of the country's best photographers. It's contained in a book called Umhlaba, of which there are not many copies available, but it was curated by 4 people, including David Goldberg and Paul Weinberg, 2 of our finest photographers. The themes in this slideshow are very important for what follows. And I want you to think about what the images, think about what responses you have to these images. They illustrate complexity and variation across the country. There's not just one land story. There are many land stories across our country. There's a complicated history. And in fact, every single case, every single restitution claim, every single redistribution project is a story in and of itself. Each of them are quite complicated. And this set of images illustrates the variety and the complexity. They also show processes of dispossession, which was central in the creation of our history of racial and class privilege. And very importantly, these images convey very powerfully the central place of land in systems of meaning, of identity, in modes of belonging in society for all South Africans, white and black, and which is one reason why the land question is so difficult, and why discussions about it are so difficult, because it's so laden with emotion. At the same time, emotions are never enough by themselves. Yes, anger, yes, despair, yes, feelings of recrimination or guilt. These are important, but we also have to use our brains to make sense of this. So think about your responses to these images, and we'll open up after the 10-minute slideshow to your views on what it shows or your questions. Okay, so the other thing that this slideshow will illustrate is the reasons why we have 3, possibly 4 programs of land reform. The one is a redistribution program, setting out to create a more equitable spread of land ownership. The second is a program of land restitution, which is an attempt to provide land back to people from whom it was dispossessed in the past. 1913 is the cutoff date, and we'll explain why that is. The third program of land reform is tenure reform, seeking to secure people's rights in land, particularly black South Africans whose rights were rendered insecure in the past. People living on private land, for example, privately owned farms, people living in communal areas, people living in informal settlements, people living in backyard shacks, people living in abandoned buildings. The majority of South Africans, 60% by our estimate of South Africans, live in houses and live on land outside the formal system of property rights, and they're not adequately secured in law even as we speak. So tenure reform, these processes illustrated. And one might say that even if it's not officially described as such, that there is a fourth program which is to do with supporting people's livelihoods. And in the rural sector, we call that agrarian reform, changing the agricultural sector of the country through land reform. And some of the images of past and present farming systems are illustrated in the slideshow. Okay, so without much ado, let's launch into the slideshow. We won't have much in the way of commentary, and then we'll open up for discussion and debate. we've got a lot to deal with. I just want to, before we get into the next session, which is restitution, ask you to look at section 25 of the Constitution, that sheet which we've handed out. And point out that section 25, 1, 2, 3, and 4 talk about land in general and talk about the expropriation and the compensation issue. Section 25, 5, 6, and 7 specifically deal with the three major programs of land reform. Section 25.5 talks about government creating the conditions to enable equitable access to land. That is essentially the enabling clause in the Constitution, which focuses on the need for redistribution, to create equitable access, whatever that term, equitable access, means. Section 25.6 is about tenure security. It's about tenure reform. It requires government to pass a law or laws to secure people's rights if they have been rendered insecure as a result of discrimination in the past. There are debates about whether or not government has adequately enacted them, and the consensus seems to be that it has not. It is currently in breach of the Constitution through not having passed a law in respect of the 17, 18, 19 million people in communal areas, so-called communal areas, the former reserves. Section 25.7 is about restitution. It says that if you are dispossessed of property after 1913, 19th of June, because of past racial discrimination, you can claim back your land or you can get equitable redress. Okay, so I just wanted to build on this history here by saying that there's an attempt here to deal with the past as well as the present. Okay, and since the Constitution is our framing document, we always have to bear it in mind. In fact, we can perhaps measure progress against these aspirations. All right, we'll get more into the Constitution later. And with that, I think we're going to draw this first session to a close, and I'm going to ask my colleague Ruth Hall to talk about the redistribution program.